Have you ever wondered why we call it a touchdown? Or why there's a fair catch in football? Or even better, why we call a safety? You know, I've always wondered about stuff like this. In fact, the thing that really got me going was wondering about what the history is behind the extra point. I mean, why even bother? Who in the world thought that it was important to put another point after the touchdown? And so I started to do some research. Well, to answer these questions, we kind of have to go way back in time. We have to go back to the 80s. No, not the 1980s, the 1880s. You see, the original game of American football was basically rugby. And it was this man, Walter Camp, who helped transform the American version of football from a copy of rugby into the game that it is today. Now, if you sit back and think about football, pretend that you don't know anything about it, and look at the game, you'll realize that it's actually really complex. It's incredibly abstract, probably more abstract than any other major sport. You've got an invisible line of scrimmage, for example. You have a certain amount of chances to make 10 yards, and the way that players line up and move about is hopelessly complicated. It's probably the hardest sport in the world to explain to somebody who has never seen it before. Well, part of the problem lies with the concept that Walter Camp helped create. This is a concept that we call scrimmage. Now, scrimmage is an interesting word. The word was derived directly from the word scrum or scrummage, which of course is a rugby word. A scrum in rugby is when both teams put their heads down and fight to gain possession of the ball, which is placed between them. And if you look into this old book of rugby rules adopted in Canada back in 1880, you will actually find scrummage referred to as scrimmage. That would be this rule, Rule 12, which describes a scrum to a T. Here it is called scrimmage. Now, the story is that Walter Camp thought that playing that way was very unscientific, and so he proposed that this messy scrum be replaced by a line of scrimmage at the United States College Football Rules Convention in 1880. It's kind of hard to believe today, but yeah, there actually was college football in 1880 and before. It really wasn't all that well organized. In fact, the early years of college football as we know it was mostly consisting of 4 Ivy League schools, and that was kind of it. But that's where the sport comes from, believe it or not. Anyway, Camp's idea was to allow the team that was brought down with the ball to hold on to the ball instead of having all these messy scrums. This turned football from a sport of constant motion into a sport of starting and stopping every time a player was taken down. It took a few years, but by 1882, Camp developed rules limiting teams to 3 downs. This is because otherwise, teams would hold on to the ball for the whole half. So teams then had 3 downs, and they had to gain 5 yards to see the downs reset. And as you know, that eventually changed to 10 yards and 4 downs. Now, the concept of scrimmage was not the only thing that came from rugby. The idea of a touchdown is also an old rugby concept. Well, back in the good old days, bringing the ball over the goal line counted for absolutely nothing. I know that sounds really strange, that you go over the goal line and it doesn't count for anything, but that's the way that it was. Back in those days, the only way to score a goal was to kick the ball through the goalposts. Those were traditionally up in the air like they are today, not on the ground like they are in soccer or association football. Now, as a side note, if you trace the soccer rules back to the 1860s or 1870s or so, you will see that a lot of teams still played with the goalposts in the air, but now I'm getting off the subject. Scoring a touchdown meant that you would get a free kick from a point parallel to where the ball was touched down, like literally touched down on the ground. As a result, the defense would try to force the offense into a touchdown at a bad angle, and the offense would always try to get a touchdown right under the goalposts. This is because the only way to score a goal was to kick the ball through the uprights, and you had to kick it at that parallel point. In other words, the so-called extra point was the only point. Well, as far as I understand, you could kick the ball while the game was still in progress to try to score, but most teams usually wouldn't try to do that. I mean, it was risky since the old game of rugby was a game of constant motion, so you'd have to get the ball in mid-run and have nobody in front of you and then somehow kick it, while you're mid-stride to get it through the goalpost. The safer way was to get the touchdown and then get the free kick. In fact, for years, there was a rule called a punt out, which would allow the scoring team to punt the ball out of the end zone in hopes of a better free kick after scoring a touchdown. To succeed, the offensive team would have to perform a fair catch when catching the ball. So what's a fair catch? Well, that involves making a mark with the feet, something that is still called a mark in games like Australian rules football. This fair catch used to be a method of advancing the ball. You could only pass backwards, a lateral, but you could kick the ball forwards, provided that a forward player could successfully make a mark in the ground and catch the ball in the air. Well, that's literally where the fair catch rule comes from, though it's of course changed a lot over the years. In fact, if you want to talk about another really geeky side point, if you look back through the history of the rules for soccer, you will see that the fair catch was actually a thing in soccer, association football, at least through the 1870s. In fact, there was a huge split in England that came between soccer and rugby when the soccer folk finally outlawed the fair catch. That was a huge scandal because there were people who specialized in fair catches who now were like out of a job. The more you know. But the biggest difference of all is the old safety rule. Now, I've got to warn you about this. It's all still a little bit murky to me, especially the history of the safety rule. But from what I've understand, it seems that the safety was actually an offensive weapon back in the early days. Well, my understanding is that there was a rule in some early forms of rugby called a rogue, which awarded teams a point for scoring a ball in their own end zone. Now, that rule went away by the time the sport went to the United States, but part of it apparently held on. Anyway, in the old days, if you scored a safety, you would bring the ball out to the 25-yard line and could choose to either keep the ball or kick to the other team. Well, it didn't take long for safeties to be seen as a negative. In fact, for a short time, tie games would be decided by which team forced the other team into the most safeties. Again, all of this makes the most sense when you realize that you couldn't pass the ball forward. It was a game of nothing but laterals, which is rugby. In fact, in the real old days, in the old rugby days, you couldn't even get in front of the ball carrier. That was, of course, an old rugby rule. As football gradually was focused on moving the ball forward, up came the concept of interference, which is what we know as blocking today. That's where you have a guy get in front of the defender and prevent him from getting to the ball carrier. But back in 1880, that was completely illegal. Anyway, things like interference or blocking is really what gives American football that unique American touch. Well, so there you have it. Touchdowns, safeties, free catches, and even the point after touchdown, well, all of these were old rugby terms. And now you know why the sport holds on to these things to this day. Okay, one more note, and I really have to say this. Though some people will claim that soccer is like the original form of football or the pure form of football, they are actually 100% wrong. Soccer, as much as I love the sport, is clearly derived from rugby, and American football is also a derivative of rugby. In fact, American football has a lot more of the original rugby rules than soccer does. In other words, if you're going to be strict and historically accurate about it, American football is a lot closer to how football was played in like the 1820s than soccer. Turns out that the Americans have had the real football all along.